Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 5. And if you're confused by that, it's okay. That makes sense. So whenever I first started the podcast, I thought that most podcasts started with an episode 0. And so typically what they tell you to do is go ahead and record at least 4 podcasts first before you kind of get it started, and then you kind of upload weekly or every other week or whatever you want to do from there. So I had already recorded 4 episodes before I actually uploaded it into like the podcast system that you use. And so whenever I went in to put the first one, episode 0, it said like 0 is not an integer. So I got off my number system. So sorry about that. We're going to get back on now. So this is technically episode 5, and we're going to talk about criticism or complaint. So, for better wife, better life, I think it's really important for us to go down this road of exploring more about the 4 horsemen, which I kind of talked about from Doctors John and Julie Gottman. So criticism is the most common of the 4 horsemen, and and as we talked about, 4 horsemen are negative styles of communication most closely associated with divorce. So we need to first be able to identify what criticism looks like, and then figure out how we can veer away from this way of communicating with our partners to sharing our needs in a much more productive way without stuffing down our own feelings. So that's typically what happens with criticism is, and I'll be honest, I think I said this before, to be honest, ladies, this tends to be something that we struggle with perhaps a little bit more than our male partners. And I realize that that's a generalization, but I also think it's pretty accurate, and it's important for us, again, to kind of lean into this in terms of, okay, what do we have to learn as opposed to what do our partners have to learn? Okay. So that's kind of where I'm going with this. And I know in my own relationship, I am definitely the one who leans more toward criticism than my husband. So I'll kind of share more about that later. So, as we kind of talked about earlier, criticism tends to be a way of blaming our partners, a way of kind of attacking the character or the person of our partner. And what we often mean to do is find a way to complain, have like a legitimate complaint. Because I promise, if you're in a relationship or a marriage where there's nothing to complain about, I guarantee you at least one person's being really, really passive and holding some stuff in. So we all have complaints in our relationships and our marriage. This is just normal. This is called being a human being. Welcome to being normal. But the way that we go about this with our partners can be really, really helpful, or it can be really damaging. So sometimes because we care so much about a relationship, or because we care about how we come across to the world or to another person, or sometimes it might just be our own personality or temperament in that maybe we're competitive, we like to be right, things like that. We sometimes can seek for ways to explain our own emotional discomfort by blaming another person or blaming our environment or not taking responsibility. But sometimes whenever we're kind of aware that we're doing that, we try and hold it in so that we're not kind of being negative in our relationship, I guess, that kind of thing. But what this really does is we just kind of stuff down things. And so, and when I say that, what I mean is that we end up trying not to complain about the relationship or being too negative, so we don't end up sharing what our needs or our wants are. So we stuff down all these negative feelings, and then that's unsustainable, right? And so we probably end up with some big blow up against our partner, or just the words come out of our mouths before we can stop it, and before we know it, we're attacking their person, their character, who they are, that kind of thing. Typically, you're going to hear words like always, never. If you've ever done counseling or couples counseling or something, you may have heard something called a you statement. And so a you statement is just that you kind of begin a complaint towards someone with the word you. And what a lot of therapists will encourage you to do is use an I statement. I need, I feel. So, which is going to be a little part of this, but that's not the end all be all. Um, but just kind of looking at what's kind of the tone behind our complaint. And if it begins with you, we are perhaps tending to blame our partners for something instead of stating our needs or our wants. So, that's something that you want to kind of think about in your own relationship. Does this come up? If it does come up, are you the one more prone to doing this? Is your partner the one more prone to doing this? What does it look like in your relationship? How does it feel if you're on the receiving end of this? How does it feel if you are on the giving end of this, right? So I kind of shared earlier that with Jake and me, I'm the one who tends to struggle more with the criticism aspect of the four horsemen. Like I said earlier, it's the most common. Um, so one of the things I think that tends to come up in our relationship, again, less so now, like fortunately we've done a lot of really hard work on this, but early on in our relationship, I really began to notice that Jake is so go with the flow. It's actually one of my favorite things about him, and that we might reserve this for another podcast, but you know how sometimes like your favorite thing about your partner also becomes your biggest complaint later on in the relationship? I would argue that's probably true for Jake and me as well. And I think on one hand, he loves how organized I am and that I make a plan and that I tend to, follow through on things. But on the other hand, sometimes that means I keep us on a tight schedule and he probably feels stifled, because Jake is super go with the flow. He loves being spontaneous. It's kind of more stressful for him to plan things out a lot in advance. Whereas for me, I get excited about it. I like list for my list for my list. So when we were first dating, I was really kind of trying to work on some personal growth. And one of my things was I really wanted to be more flexible. Um, in terms of relationships and just emotionally. And so as I was doing that and we were dating, I just began to notice it felt to me there were a lot of last minute changes, perhaps to plans that were made, or we maybe would go into an evening that we knew we were going to spend time together, but there was no plan. And when Jake and I were dating, we lived about 45 minutes apart from each other. And so sometimes whenever I would finish work on a Friday evening, if we didn't have a particular plan, I noticed once we had dated for a while, I knew that traffic was gonna be pretty bad, and so if we didn't have a specific plan, I would kind of put off, driving down to his area of town before we went out to dinner or something like that, and whereas if we had more of a specific plan, I may have tried to get off work early or go a different route or something like that, and so I began to notice that more rigidity kinda crept up into, my way of thinking or my way of experiencing Jake, and again, I was trying to work on all this personal growth and trying to be flexible, so for a long time, I just didn't say anything. But, when it would finally kind of come out, it wasn't pretty, and it was just kind of like, we're always late. We never have plans. You never think about this stuff in advance. I mean, I really wonder, do you actually care about our relationship? Right? Like, you get the idea. The criticism kind of ended up coming out for sure. So, one of the things that I've really had to work on, I continue to work on flexibility. I promise you that that's going to be kind of like a daily or weekly um, growth opportunity of mine. And now Jake and I are able to use a lot of humor with that, which is really helpful for me because it allows me to kind of let out what I'm thinking without making him feel badly at all. And he can also kind of tease me a little bit in a helpful way that kind of just gives me a little nudge of like, hey babe, you're being a little rigid right now, and I can hear that okay. So again, teasing, probably another subject for a different podcast. So we'll get there. But as I was kind of working on healthy communication, I really had to figure out, okay, I can be flexible. I need to work on this. And it is also really important to me that we be on time for certain things. It's really important to me that we make a plan to decrease, to me, what maybe was frivolous time that we weren't spending together, which for me, definitely when I lived in Houston, was spending time in traffic. Oh my gosh, that was really hard. So, as I kind of had to work on, being more flexible and recognizing one of Jake's strengths is his spontaneity and just being super go with the flow. He's such an easygoing person. I mean, Jake is very even keeled. I often say he's like the most even keeled personality I've ever met. So just really wanting to appreciate that. But for things I could feel some energy in my body, or I began to ruminate or something, finding ways to rephrase my criticism to be more of a complaint. So it may have been something a little bit more like, "Hey, babe, it's really important to me that we be on time for this. What do you think is the best time for us to leave that will be on time?" And so we'd agree on that time. And then I would ask him, would it be okay for you, or would it help you if I kind of let you know when we had 30 minutes until we need to leave, or 15 minutes until we needed to leave? And Jake is so open minded. He's like, oh my gosh, yes, that would be really helpful. Okay, that sounds good. And I kind of had to learn how to come around to this perspective that I'm his partner. And being on time is something that tends to be more of a strength for me in our relationship anyway. I'm not going to say I'm perfect at that. But that's an area of strength for me between the two of us. And Jake has many other strengths in our relationship in different areas. And so that's one thing that I try to do, whether it's just kind of saying, hey, babe, we got 15 more minutes before we need to leave, or texting him about something about the time, or giving him a reminder about, something that he needs to do that would be helpful for us. He is really open to that, and it helps me to not get so worked up about, some of the things of just not being on time or whatever it may be. And so we kind of really worked on that, and I've really tried to work hard at how can I partner alongside my husband instead of kind of being this condescending, criticizing kind of partner. So, with my clients, and as you guys know, I work a lot with women. I notice it in a very similar way. I have a lot of clients who they recognize how hard their husbands work, and or their partners work, and one of the things that may happen is they will also try and stuff their feelings or their needs. And I kind of call it being superwoman. They'll try and do everything, whether it's wife, mom, girlfriend, their own job, whatever it is. And so they just won't ever speak up, or hardly ever speak up. And, or it'll come out in a big blow up, kind of like what I was describing with Jake and me. And I think the most common area I see this is a lot of resentment about the distribution of house chores or just responsibilities between the couple. And I talk a lot about this with clients. There's that, I think, kind of saying that both people think that they're doing 60% of the work. And then, kind of some more recent research in the last year, I think, came out that said among even egalitarian roles with couples. So couples who value more, less traditional roles, but who value more equal kind of roles in terms of income and responsibilities and all that. Even then, it seems like the woman is likely doing 90% of the work. So this comes up a lot, and what I work with my clients on is, first of all, identifying what's the unmet need. And then I kind of look at, okay, well, how are you expressing that need to your partner? Most of the time, my client has not expressed that need at all. It's this sense of, well, I don't want to bother him or her, or he or she should know me well enough to know. Or sometimes it's, I've already told them 3 different times, I'm not going to tell them again. So this is really hard, right? Whenever these things happen. And I just have to look at, well, what's working for you? Is this effective? Is it effective to stuff your feelings or to blow up? Right. And so that's kind of one area that we come at it is, do you want to be right, or do you want to be effective? Do you want to keep doing what you're doing? and not get your needs met? Or do you want to make maybe a little bit of an uncomfortable change and work toward getting a need met, not only for you, but probably your partner as well? Because I know one thing for me is as a partner, I really value it like when Jake speaks up for what he needs, which he's a pretty low key guy. He does not have a lot of huge requests at all. So when I know something about him that is a need or a desire of his, I'm like, yay, okay, this is really helpful. And so I think our partners are very similar. I think it's kind of like what Brene Brown says, clear is kind, right? So I think the more that we are clear with our partners, the kinder that is, and the more on the same page we all are. So what we can do instead of criticism is what's called a soft startup. So it's kind of like what I said earlier. The Gottmans kind of refer to this, and a lot of family therapists refer to this as an I statement. So instead of saying, you always do this, you never do this, here's what I want you guys to practice. And there's a few different ways of doing this. Esther Perel has a XYZ way of doing this. If you've ever heard of dialectical behavior therapy, there's a skill called Dear Man, but they all look very similar. So Esther Perel's is when X happens, I feel Y. And I would like for Z to happen, or I need Z. In DBT, the Dear Man skill is when you, I feel, I need, because. And now I'll put my own kind of therapist spin on this. I think it's also really helpful if you use an easy manner, if even you use a little bit of humor, if you're making sure that your facial expressions and your body language are open and what we call non-dominant, right? So just if you're watching me on YouTube right now, you can see my hands are up, kind of hunching my shoulders a little bit, my head's to the side. I really need us to be on time. That's really important to me, right? That comes a lot, that comes across a little bit better than if I had my arms crossed across my chest saying, I really need us to be on time. Right? Like the words might be the same, but our nonverbals and our paraverbals are equally important, perhaps if not more so. So I want to give you guys some encouragement to really learn how to identify an unmet need within your relationship with your partner and practice a soft startup by identifying what your need is and just letting your partner know what your need is and how they can help you. All right. Well, good luck, you guys, with practicing your soft startups, and I'll see you next time.